His forehead was split open by a bullet fired at point-blank range. Grigori Rasputin was already dead before his body hit the freezing river. The autopsy showed no poison in his stomach, no water in his lungs, just 3 bullet wounds, one to the chest, one to the back, and one that destroyed his skull. Yet the men who killed him claimed something else. They said he survived poisoned wine, ignored cyanide-laced cakes, stood back up after being shot, clawed his way out of a basement, and finally collapsed, only after being beaten and drowned in the icy Neva River. That story became legend, but it wasn't true. The real story of Rasputin's death is not about a man who couldn't die. It's about how a small group of nobles used myth to cover up a political execution. Behind their lies was fear, not just of Rasputin's influence over the royal family, but of what Russia was about to become. This video will show how a wandering mystic rose from nothing, captured a dying empire, and ended up face down in a river while the people who killed him rewrote the ending. But Rasputin's end is only the beginning. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born on January 21, 1869, in the small Siberian village of Pokrovskoye. It was a remote place, isolated, deeply religious, and surrounded by frozen plains and poverty. His father, Yefim, worked as a coachman and peasant farmer. The family lived in a one-room wooden house with a dirt floor and no formal schooling. Most villagers were illiterate, and Rasputin would remain barely literate for most of his life. He grew up in a country where faith and superstition were more accessible than medicine or education. Orthodox Christianity dominated local culture, but in rural Russia, mysticism and folk beliefs often blended with official religion. In the 1880s, Rasputin gained a reputation for strange behavior, wandering alone, claiming visions, and speaking of holy powers. After a short marriage and several children, he left his village around 1897 to become a stranik, a religious wanderer. He walked across vast distances, visiting monasteries, sleeping outdoors, and claiming spiritual insight from dreams and divine voices. At a time when the Russian Empire was facing internal decay, economic stagnation, failed reforms, and rising revolutionary ideas, people like Rasputin began to attract attention. He was part of a larger movement, peasants and monks who promised healing, prayer, and guidance in a country where many felt abandoned by science, medicine, and the monarchy. By 1903, Rasputin had reached the capital, St. Petersburg. He looked unclean, he smelled, he rarely changed clothes, but he spoke with confidence about God, and the aristocracy, especially religious women, were fascinated. This was no accident. The empire was weak, the people were angry, and the royal family, desperate for a miracle, was about to let a peasant inside the palace. But Rasputin didn't just enter the palace. He made himself impossible to remove. Rasputin had no formal education. He could barely read, but he believed he was chosen. He claimed his first religious visions came during childhood fevers. In his village, such claims weren't mocked, they were respected. People believed visions could come from God, and illness could open the door. By age 28, he began calling himself a man of God. But he didn't follow priests. He rejected the church hierarchy. Instead, he walked the roads alone, eating what strangers gave him, offering prayers, and claiming divine insight. He met a series of wandering mystics who shaped his worldview. They told him that sin could lead to salvation, that resisting temptation was less holy than giving in, repenting, and feeling God's mercy. This idea, that sin brought people closer to God, fit Rasputin's habits. He drank heavily. He had sex with followers. He boasted that physical pleasure made spiritual pain more meaningful. Rasputin also became fascinated by a banned sect called the Kleists, known for ecstatic worship, secret rituals, and the belief that salvation came through suffering and sin. Rasputin denied ever joining them, but many of his later behaviors matched their teachings. What made Rasputin stand out wasn't just his belief system, it was how he used it. He believed his prayers could heal the sick. And when a noblewoman in St. Petersburg claimed he cured her migraines, he began to gain access to salons, parlors, and private drawing rooms. He spoke in riddles. He stared without blinking. He didn't flatter elites. He acted above them. That made him seem powerful in a society where most bowed and scraped for approval. Some called him a fake. Others called him holy. Either way, no one ignored him. And at the center of this rising attention was a royal crisis. Tsarevich Alexei, the only son of the Romanovs, was bleeding to death from a disease no doctor could cure. What happened next wasn't faith, it was timing. In 1905, Tsarina Alexandra was desperate. Her only son, Alexei, had inherited hemophilia condition that made even small injuries life-threatening. He bruised easily. Internal bleeding could start without warning. Doctors couldn't help him. A noblewoman introduced Rasputin to the royal family that year. He didn't look like a healer. His hair was greasy, his beard untrimmed. But when he prayed at Alexei's bedside, the boy's bleeding slowed. It wasn't a cure, but Alexandra believed it was a miracle. From that point forward, Rasputin became part of the Romanov court. He had no official title, no formal position, but his influence was real. He met privately with the Tsarina. He advised her on court appointments. When Alexei's health worsened, she called Rasputin before the doctors. Nicholas II, the Tsar, was cautious but passive. Alexandra, on the other hand, believed Rasputin had been sent by God. In 1906, Rasputin was introduced to senior church officials and began attracting scrutiny. His letters to Alexandra became more personal. He signed them, "Your loyal son" or "Your humble servant." He was allowed to roam the palace freely. Servants complained but were ignored. In public, rumors grew. Rasputin was seen drinking, visiting prostitutes, and accepting bribes. In private, Alexandra shielded him. To her, none of that mattered if he could keep her son alive. By 1912, when Alexei nearly died in Poland, Rasputin sent a telegram from hundreds of miles away. After receiving it, Alexandra claimed her son's bleeding stopped again. That cemented his power. Doctors had no explanation. Politicians were furious. And members of the royal family began to whisper, this peasant had too much access. Rasputin had entered the palace as a healer. Now he was shaping who got promoted, who was fired, and who the empress trusted. But Rasputin didn't just gain influence, he made enemies. By 1914, the Russian Empire was at war and falling apart. The Russian military was suffering massive defeats. Food shortages were spreading. Public anger was rising. And while the empire bled at the front, Rasputin tightened his grip at the palace. When Tsar Nicholas II left for the Eastern Front in 1915 to command the army personally, he made a critical mistake. He left Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs. Alexandra, in turn, relied entirely on Rasputin. From 1915 to 1916, Rasputin influenced dozens of high-level appointments. He advised the dismissal of ministers, governors, and generals. He suggested replacements based on loyalty, not competence. He even intervened in the Orthodox Church, pushing his allies into bishoprics. The result was instability at every level. Bureaucrats were confused. Generals were furious. Nobles were panicking. Inside the palace, Rasputin's enemies grew. They came from every direction. Conservative aristocrats, liberal reformers, royal cousins, generals, priests. Each group saw a different threat, but all agreed on the source. By late 1916, the empire was collapsing. The Duma, Russia's legislative body, demanded reforms. Soldiers were deserting. Peasants were starving. And through it all, Rasputin remained. He had no official title, no army, no ministry, but he was seen as the man behind the throne. He had become a symbol of everything broken in Russia's government. The problem wasn't just political, it was dynastic. The Tsarevich's life still depended on Rasputin's presence, or so Alexandra believed. And if Alexei died, the Romanov line ended. That created a paradox. Rasputin's influence was destabilizing the empire, but removing him, in Alexandra's eyes, risked killing her son. The royal family was paralyzed, so the nobles acted without them. A plan was set in motion. Kill Rasputin quietly, blame no one, and remove the problem before it brought down the crown. But removing him wouldn't be easy, because Rasputin wasn't just an advisor anymore. He was a myth. Rasputin held no rank, but his decisions reshaped the Russian state. From 1915 to 1916, the Russian government rotated through 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, 3 foreign ministers, and 3 war ministers. The one constant behind those shifts was Rasputin. He pushed for appointments based on loyalty, not merit. He recommended men who flattered him, who obeyed Alexandra, and who ignored warnings from the army or the Duma. One of his closest allies, Alexander Protopopov, became Minister of the Interior. Despite having no experience with domestic affairs and a known history of erratic behavior, his tenure oversaw censorship crackdowns, random arrests, and street-level surveillance. Even more critical was Rasputin's interference in the Russian Orthodox Church. He lobbied for certain bishops, removed others, and convinced Alexandra that the traditional clergy were corrupt. His actions alienated senior church officials and sowed distrust among priests. The state began to reflect Rasputin's preferences: chaotic, suspicious, and isolated. Outside the palace, fear took hold. Political opponents whispered about secret police loyal to Rasputin. Journalists were censored or jailed. Satirical cartoons of Rasputin flooded underground newspapers, depicting him as a hypnotist, a demon, or even the secret lover of the empress. Inside the palace, servants were monitored. Those who spoke against Rasputin were dismissed. Some claimed that Alexandra used Rasputin as a spy, having him report who was loyal and who was not. What had started as a religious relationship between healer and empress had transformed into a network of patronage and fear. There were no public executions, no mass purges, but careers were destroyed, policies reversed, and national morale collapsed, all while Rasputin denied having any power at all. To his supporters, he claimed to be a humble man of God. To his enemies, he was a manipulator cloaked in holiness. And behind it all was a silence from Nicholas II. The Tsar knew of the chaos. He received letters, warnings, and pleas, but he did nothing. The empire became a pressure cooker, and Rasputin was the flame beneath it. But pressure does not rise forever. Eventually, it explodes. By late 1916, Rasputin was surrounded by enemies and running out of allies. Inside the royal court, even distant Romanov relatives viewed him as a threat. Letters from noblewomen shifted in tone. Former admirers now warned of moral decay and public shame. One of them called him a devil in monk's clothing. Senior members of the Russian Orthodox Church openly condemned Rasputin's presence at the palace. Some demanded that Nicholas remove him. Others warned that his influence was heretical. But Nicholas, pressured by Alexandra, did nothing. Even Rasputin's own supporters began to hesitate. Some noticed his drinking had increased. Others whispered about blackmail, sexual misconduct, and bribes. Still, no one dared challenge him openly. Rasputin knew he was hated. He wrote paranoid letters to Alexandra describing enemies in the shadows who wanted him gone. He claimed to sense danger in dreams. He stopped visiting public places, kept his circle small, and began to act as though he were under constant threat. He also believed in prophecy. In a letter dated December 1916, Rasputin warned the Tsar, "If I am killed by common men, you will survive. But if I am killed by nobles, the monarchy will fall and your family will die." It wasn't just superstition. Rasputin was aware that high-ranking nobles were planning something. He may not have known the details, but he had reasons to be afraid. He had humiliated generals, bishops, and aristocrats. He had inserted himself between the empress and her own advisors, and he had become the face of a government that was collapsing. At the same time, Rasputin clung more tightly to Alexandra. Their letters became more urgent. She called him our friend. She said Russia's fate was tied to his soul. In reality, it was tied to something else. Silence. The public wanted him removed. The government wanted him gone. The royal family couldn't agree, and Rasputin, isolated and surrounded by hidden enemies, began to move through St. Petersburg as if each day might be his last. He was right, because while Rasputin waited for visions, the men who feared him were making real plans. By late 1916, Rasputin's physical condition was deteriorating. He had aged rapidly. Witnesses described him as gaunt, pale, and frequently unwashed. He had difficulty walking long distances and sometimes appeared disoriented in public. His posture was hunched. His once booming voice had become hoarse and quiet. His mental state showed similar decline. Close observers noted increased paranoia. Rasputin claimed to hear whispers in empty rooms. He told followers he was being followed by shadows and watched from rooftops. He said he saw omens in the sky, and at times refused to eat food prepared by others. His drinking had become more frequent and more public. He would disappear for days, visiting taverns, drinking heavily, and ranting about betrayal. When he returned, he often claimed he had seen visions of the Virgin Mary or warnings from dead saints. These symptoms worried even his supporters. Some noted he spoke to himself under his breath. Others described sudden mood shifts from laughing and singing to long silences or sharp outbursts. Servants reported that Rasputin sometimes stayed awake for entire nights pacing the floor, muttering about danger and prophecy. The pressures on him were mounting. Alexandra's dependency had reached its peak. She begged him not to travel far from the capital. She told him that without his presence, her son might die, and that Tsar's spirit would collapse. Rasputin, exhausted and erratic, reassured her, but his letters grew darker. In one of his last notes, he warned Alexandra that something terrible is coming, a force that cannot be stopped. Behind his spiritual language was a man showing signs of collapse. Isolation, chronic stress, alcoholism, and sleep deprivation were taking their toll. Rasputin had once stood in palaces and commanded attention. Now, he wandered the streets of Petrograd under a coat caked in dirt and snow, eyes sunken, often speaking in riddles no one could interpret. He no longer appeared powerful. He appeared sick. He no longer controlled events. He responded to them, and while his body declined, so did the myth he built. Rumors of sexual blackmail, bribery, and even treason began to overtake the old image of the mad monk with healing hands. But Rasputin had one thing left this prophecy. He had warned, if the nobles killed him, the Romanovs would fall, and within weeks, they would test that claim. On December 29, 1916, Rasputin was invited to the home of Prince Felix Yusupov. The prince had written days earlier, claiming his wife needed healing. Rasputin hesitated, but eventually agreed. He was seen leaving his home that evening, wearing a heavy fur coat, accompanied by a trusted follower who stayed behind at the gate. He never returned. Inside the basement of the Moika Palace, a group of conspirators waited. Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Vladimir Purishkevich, and others had prepared wine and pastries allegedly laced with cyanide. What happened next has been debated for over a century. Yusupov claimed Rasputin drank the poisoned wine and ate the cakes, but showed no reaction. He said Rasputin laughed and asked for more. Modern forensic reviews suggest otherwise. No cyanide was found in Rasputin's system during autopsy. Either the poison failed, degraded, or was never used. After some time, Rasputin was shot in the chest at close range. According to Yusupov, he collapsed, then suddenly revived, lunged at the prince, and tried to flee. The conspirators then shot him again in the back, beat him, and finally shot him once more in the forehead, at point-blank range. This third shot was likely the cause of death. His body was wrapped in cloth, tied with ropes, and dumped into the frozen Neva River. Contrary to legend, the autopsy revealed no significant water in the lungs, indicating Rasputin did not drown. He was already dead. There were no final words recorded, no dramatic confrontation, no last prayer, just a corpse pulled from icy water with bullet wounds and blood-stiffened hair. His body was quickly buried, but not for long. When revolutionaries took control just weeks later, Rasputin's remains were exhumed and destroyed. His bones were burned in secret, and no grave remains. The myth claimed he refused to die. The reality was different. He was lured, betrayed, shot, and dumped, just like any other enemy of the state. But the prophecy he left behind was still unanswered. Would the nobles' actions stop the empire from collapsing? Or had they only made it worse? The men who killed Rasputin believed they were saving Russia. They expected his death would restore public trust in the monarchy, remove a destabilizing figure, and calm the growing revolutionary mood. It did none of those things. The murder was exposed almost immediately. Yusupov could not keep quiet. Within days, rumors spread through Petrograd. People whispered that Rasputin had been killed by aristocrats. The Empress demanded an investigation. Nicholas II was forced to act. But instead of punishing the killer severely, he issued soft penalties. Yusupov was exiled to his estate. Grand Duke Dmitry was sent to the Persian front. No formal charges were filed. This leniency made the Romanovs look weak. To the public, it confirmed what they already believed. The empire was crumbling from the inside, and no one, least of all the Tsar, was in control. Meanwhile, Alexandra withdrew even further. She blamed the government. She blamed the military. She insisted that Rasputin's death had put her son at risk. Her isolation deepened. She refused to accept that Rasputin was gone. Inside the palace, there was no recovery. Rasputin's assassination had created a power vacuum, but no one filled it. The empire drifted. The army continued losing battles. Food supplies collapsed. Protests turned to riots. Riots turned to rebellion. Just 72 days after Rasputin's death, the February Revolution began. By March 1917, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty collapsed. The Tsar, the Empress, and their children were placed under house arrest. Within a year, the entire imperial family would be executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The men who killed Rasputin did not save the monarchy. They accelerated its fall. Rasputin's prophecy, written in his final days, echoed through the chaos. If I am killed by nobles, you will lose your throne, and your family will be no more. At the time, most dismissed it as superstition, but in the end, that's exactly what happened. Historians today view Rasputin very differently than the people of his time. To his contemporaries, he was either a holy man or a fraud, nothing in between. But modern scholars see him as a product of a decaying empire, a man whose power came not from magic, but from vacuum. Rasputin filled a space that science, medicine, and governance had failed to occupy. The Romanovs didn't trust their generals. Alexandra didn't trust her ministers, but she trusted Rasputin because he offered answers, even if they weren't rational. Some historians argue that Rasputin was not manipulative, but opportunistic. He didn't create chaos, they say. He simply benefited from it. He gave advice when asked. He used his image to protect himself. He didn't seek official power, but he didn't turn it down either. Others take a harsher view. They see him as a political liability, someone who used mysticism to mask corruption. They point to bribes, sexual scandals, and government interference as evidence that Rasputin undermined the state. New forensic studies have challenged old stories about his death. The poison may never have existed. The drowning was likely a myth. And the unkillable monk legend was created by his killers, not his followers. There are even debates about his motives. Some researchers believe Rasputin genuinely cared about Alexei's health and never wanted political influence. Others believe he used the child's illness to hold power over Alexandra and control state decisions through guilt and fear. Over time, Rasputin has become more symbol than man. In books and films, he is portrayed as a sorcerer, a demon, or a mad monk. These versions tell more about the fears of those telling the story than about Rasputin himself. In reality, he was something simpler and harder to explain. A peasant who entered a crumbling palace, a wanderer who filled a void in a dying empire, and a man whose death was supposed to save a monarchy, but instead became a warning about what happens when fear takes the place of leadership. Rasputin did not hold a government office. He passed no laws. He wrote no policies. He commanded no troops. Yet his presence reshaped the final years of the Russian Empire. His rise exposed a monarchy that no longer trusted its own advisors. His influence revealed how personal fear of illness, loss, and death could override systems built to govern millions. And his murder showed how myths are used to justify violence. After Rasputin's death, the monarchy fell within weeks. The royal family was wiped out. The Russian Orthodox Church lost status, and the empire gave way to revolution, war, and eventually dictatorship. Rasputin's legacy is not mystical. It's institutional. He showed how quickly power can be privatized, how state decisions can be driven by superstition, secrecy, and personal loyalty when formal structures collapse. In that sense, Rasputin was not a cause of decay. He was a symptom. A man with no education, no title, and no army became more powerful than generals and ministers. Not because he was extraordinary, but because the state around him was already hollow. His story isn't about magic. It's about failure, and that failure didn't end with his death. It's a reminder that when institutions break down, people don't turn to reason. They turn to belief. Rasputin was hard to kill, but some rulers didn't stop at killing. One queen didn't just betray her husband. She had him torn apart by dogs. If you thought Rasputin's murder was shocking, wait until you see what power looked like in 14th century Korea. Click now to watch the horrible death of the queen who fed her husband to dogs. It's darker, it's bloodier, and it's real history, not myth.